Hey friend, Alex back with Audio Edges, and today we're talking about 6 mixing tips that were turning points in my career, created an entire turning point because of what this did to my mixes. Now, we try not to use the words game changing too much on this channel because I find it dilutes information, but if there were actually some really game changing tips, these mixing tips are going to be some of the most important ones. If you know me on this channel, you know that I do this mixing and mastering thing full time. I'm trying to give as much information as I can to you so you don't have to take years to get good at this skill like I did. I can speed you along that entire process. So let's dive into number 1. Tip 1, developing my own frequency associations. What the heck does that mean? I'm talking about understanding the frequency spectrum, 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, and how you as a mix engineer and your unique ears relate to and understand that frequency spectrum. Now, I made a video a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, it was all about listening to frequencies and making associations. Maybe that low information between 20 and 200 hertz we can associate with thunder rumble, and maybe something between 3 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz we can associate with birds chirping outside, this little like whistle type of sound. That presence, that clickiness, creating your own associations that make sense to you makes such a big difference for your ear, because all of a sudden when you're working you can recognize frequencies. You can hear that there's a little too much boxiness or a little too much honkiness. Okay, if you want to learn what those words mean and learn how to hear them and be able to say in words a very narrow frequency ballpark, like you can literally hear 3.2K. And when you say that and when you say it out loud, you're pretty close to where it actually is. If you want to learn that skill, check out the description. I'll put a video there, but don't leave yet because you got to learn these next 5 tips. Let's get into number 2. Tip number 2 is getting good at using saturation and also clipping in your mixes. Well, what does that mean? I cannot stress enough how much these 2 techniques have revolutionized my work, from saturation being a sound that's emulating what analog gear would traditionally do. When you push it too hard, you push the input too hard, and you push into the transistors a little bit too hard, it creates a little bit of richness, some warmth, some crunchiness, and this can be really pleasing to the ear because we're using that nice soft knee compression, causing saturation in our mixes that emulates a lot of classic analog recordings that everyone loves. Learning to use saturation properly, not overusing it, but making sure you're incorporating some when necessary, is a really important part of now having a modern sound and getting to know this modern sound as a professional mix engineer. If you don't use saturation, your mixes might sound a little bit too sterile. So it's a good tool to have in your toolbox. Learn how to use it, get to know it. Your mixes are going to be a lot better, especially when you get to know clipping. Now, clipping, on another hand, is something that's going to help us retain the dynamics in our mixes and also get more volume out of our mixes. Now, clipping relates to saturation. I put these both under tip number 2 because you can do something called soft clipping, which applies saturation at and above the clipping point, depending what clipper you're using. What using a clipper will do in your mixes and masters, instead of using a limiter all the time, it'll work a little differently because you're not squishing the top of the waveform down, you're actually just chopping it clean off. Now, if you do hard clipping, you're chopping it straight off, and this can be a little bit harsh and abrasive depending how much clipping you're doing. If you're not doing that much clipping, hard clipping can still sound pretty transparent, at least from my experience. It all depends. So get to know clipping, hard clipping, soft clipping, and learn how to use it to retain some of that dynamic range, or at least the illusion of dynamic range that a clipper, I find, can often do much better than a limiter. So if you want to learn more about that, I'll put another video in the description for a video I did about clipping, and you can do a deep dive with me on that. In the meantime, let's move on to tip number 3 that created a turning point in my career as a mix engineer. Number 3 is learning how to mix vocals properly. This was the game changer to me, where I could actually start charging money for what I did. For a long time, I was confident just mixing kind of instrumental stuff, but when it came to the vocal mix, I didn't know if I was doing the compression properly. I didn't know if I was EQing the vocals properly. I was nervous even just to record vocals in case I do something wrong. Once you actually tackle the vocal mixing part of mixing and get confident with it and get good at it, changes everything, because at that point I could combine that with my skill of instrumental mixing, and now I can actually offer mixing as a service. I can actually mix a full song. You got to get good at mixing vocals properly. Now, luckily on this channel we have a lot of tutorials for that, so you can check all of those out, but getting good at mixing vocals is everything. Now, it's not just about EQ and compression. Now, there are a few secret tips to getting a really good vocal mix, and I don't say secret because it's like a gate kept thing. I'm just saying secret because a lot of people don't even realize they exist. you don't know what you don't know, right? So first trick to getting your vocals really polished is obviously get a clean recording, set up your room for success, set up your environment for success. You're not recording a bunch of, echoes into your mic that get brought out with compression. Get a little vocal shield, maybe use a dynamic mic if you have a really, reverberant room or space that you're working in, or set up some acoustic treatment in your room. And once you have a good take to work with, it's going to be a lot easier to get a good vocal mix. Now you want to do a little bit of prep on your vocal. Maybe you want to do some clip gaining. You want to set the volumes of the words a little bit more consistently in advance before even hitting your compressor. You want to do a little bit of editing. Maybe you want to clean up some of the breaths or some of the mouth clicks. We get a lot of mouth clicks in vocals. A vocal mix is amateur when you just hear these clicks all over it, like saliva noises. Not good. Then get good at EQ and compression. That's something I teach all over this channel. I encourage you to check it out. And once you get good at mixing vocals and having some effects in your toolbox as well that you can pull out, makes a big difference. So learn how to mix vocals, learn some of the tricks that pros do that amateurs don't, and you're going to be in really good shape, my friend. Let's move on to tip number 4. Tip number 4 is getting over the fear of just turning knobs. And I'm talking about turning knobs aggressively. This is probably going to be in plug-in format for a lot of you. So when you're doing an EQ boost or a cut, try really boosting it up. Try really cutting it a lot. I'm not talking like, oh, bring it down like 0.3 dB. No, like pull it down 3 dB. 4 dB, see what it does, and then back it off. You can't make an EQ move until you actually know what it does, and it's really hard to hear. If you can hear 0.1 dB move, this is going to be one of those times where you see that meme where it's like, oh, my plugin wasn't bypassed the whole time, And sometimes it's okay to make little tweaks. I'm not saying don't make little tweaks. I make them all the time. But before you make the little tweak, make it a big tweak first so you can confidently hear what you're doing and then back it off after and find the right spot for it. Don't be afraid to turn those knobs. That's an EQ. Do it with a compressor as well. Do it with a clipper as well. Do it with saturation. Do it with everything in mixing. Turn those knobs. Get more aggressive with it. I'm not saying you have to keep aggressive sounding moves, when you turn a knob, but just hear what it's doing before you try and just tweak something a little bit. Turn it a lot. That will make a big difference in getting over that fear of just turning things. You got to realize, friend, you can turn something up and then turn it down. But tweaking like this, that's good. And that's a lot of what we do in mixing and mastering is minute tweaks, detailed listening, but turn those knobs. Don't be afraid, okay? You can always back it off later, but get to know the sounds of these plugins. Push them to their limits a bit. You're going to find sounds and unlock your own sounds as a mixer that you didn't even know were there. And sometimes the boldest moves can even turn into happy accidents that yield really great results. So twist those knobs, don't be afraid to make mistakes, and just get inside that mix, my friend. Tip number 5 that made a huge difference in my skill as a mix engineer is getting your room set up properly, getting your room calibration right, okay? Now there's a combination of this. There's your speakers, right? You can have really nice speakers, but if you don't know your room and you haven't calibrated your room or maybe use some acoustic treatment, it's like trying to paint in the dark. You're not hearing what is actually coming out of the speakers. You're hearing the speakers in the room, okay? And this will make a big difference to your mixes. It's gonna bias your mixes more than you know. I didn't realize the serious impact this was having on my mixes until I used some calibration software. Sound ID Reference is the one I use. I know there's some really good ones out there, but using that calibration software, measuring your room with this little microphone and then applying that frequency curve, that calibration curve to neutralize those speakers, makes a huge difference, especially in rooms that weren't designed from the ground up for mixing. Now, this is often really going to be the case. Most likely, everyone watching this video, you might have a room you mix in, but it's unlikely it was, you brought in acousticians and designed it, scientifically. And if you did that, that's great and also amazing. But the main point I'm getting to here is you don't need that to get great mixes. You just need to do these things. Set up your monitors properly in an equilateral triangle. Make sure you're not too close to the wall behind you to avoid speaker boundary interference. That's when sound bounces off the back wall and then you're hearing it combined with the sound of the speakers back to your ears. Try to set up your desk somewhere where it's symmetrical with the room, okay? You don't want to set up in a corner because bass energy collects in a corner. Pick a good spot of symmetry in your room, get that desk and speaker set up good, and then I recommend some type of acoustic treatment. Now, maybe you've built some acoustic panels. You can hang those around your room. There's acoustic absorption, which are panels. Most likely you'll be using something like rock wool, spun mineral wool for this. this. And then there's diffusion, which is sometimes those like kind of foam panels that you see. Those don't do a whole ton for your room, but they will scatter the high frequencies. Diffusers scatter, they don't absorb, okay? So you might set up some acoustic treatment in your room, and then with the calibration software, something like Sound ID Reference, I found that combination gets you the best results, okay? If you're unable to do any of those things, don't worry, friend. You can still get great mixes, but you're gonna be needing to do some reference checking, okay? And this is for mix translation. It's always good to check the mix in the car, check them on your headphones, AirPods, listen on your phone. If you're not able to mix in an environment that you've designed and calibrated for mixing, you're probably gonna be needing to do some more referencing to make sure your mix is translating. So if you're not able to set up your space like I described, just make sure you're doing enough referencing to make sure your mix translates. There's even new technology for this. These are the Slate VSX headphones. This uses a software to emulate mix rooms and mix studios where you can do a whole bunch of reference checking. So something like this could be a really good alternative for you as well. And with that, let's move on to our final tip, number 6. If you want better mixes, you might just need to get better sounds. Now, when I first heard this advice from a friend of mine, I kind of dismissed it. I didn't really take it that seriously. But once I actually started applying this, it makes a huge difference. So think of like that first time you downloaded Splice and started going through the sounds on Splice. And if you don't know what Splice is, it's a sampling library where you can grab a whole ton of kicks, snares, little loops and things that are most commonly already processed and already mixed. They just sound great off the bat. And if you want to get really good sounding mixes, it would make sense that if you just use a really good sounding sample from the beginning, it's going to make mixing a lot easier for you too. Now, I'm not saying that as a cop-out. Of course you could get kind of any sample and mix it to a great quality if you know what you're doing. But if you just start with good sounds to begin with, as a fact that you're going to be able to get a good mix out of those sounds because they sound great. This can also be sample libraries. I just updated my native instruments and was looking at these kind of old Contact 5 library violin sounds compared to one of the new violin libraries, which on its own sells for something like $300. The reality is now I'm working with better sounds, which is going to make getting better mixes much easier. Better samples, better VST instruments. If you're a guitar player, maybe it's using a better software amp. If you're a vocalist, maybe it's working on your voice itself and choosing a good mic that suits your voice, okay? Getting everything right at the source. Better sounds equals better mixes. I promise you that, my friend, because starting with great sound means you're spending less time fixing in the mix and more time enhancing in the mix. See what I mean? So if you enjoyed these 6 mixing tips, I have something I think you'll enjoy even more. If you're wondering, okay, this is all great, but how do I even get a good balance of my mix to begin with when it comes to EQ, compression, possible effects? I got you covered, my friend. It's all for free. It is my home mixing cheat sheet, and it is a chart of 1 page with a whole ton of go-to settings for EQ, compression, possible effects for vocals, drums, keys, bass, guitar, synths, strings. So go download the free home mixing cheat sheet now. The link will be at the top of the description for you. I've gotten some really good feedback on it because if you're new to mixing, it has the potential to change your mixes drastically because you're knowing where to look, what to boost, what to cut, and what settings you can use as a starting point in this crazy world of mixing music. My friend, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to make sure that this isn't the last time we ever see each other. Would love to see you again next time. And until then, happy mixing.